If you love photographing wildlife but come away with photos which are just too noisy, then this is the video for you. Because in today's video, I want to be giving you the skills that you can use to minimize the amount of noise that you have in your photographs. But if you do come away with noisy photographs, how you can deal with them in editing afterwards. And if you're new here, then hey, I'm Rich. On this channel, I love to talk about wildlife photography and trying to make it accessible for all. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, consider hitting that subscribe button down below. Let's start by talking about where noise originates from. Well, there are two main sources of noise, the first being ISO. Now the ISO on our camera relates to the sensitivity of our sensor. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive that sensor is going to be to light, and as such your photos are going to end up being brighter by having an ISO. The downside of having a very sensitive sensor is it also leads to a lot of noise. So if we're looking to minimize the amount of noise in our photographs, we want to reduce that ISO as much as possible. Now there's two main settings which interact with ISO to help deliver the exposure of our final photograph. The first of which is aperture. Now aperture is essentially how wide the iris is on our lens. Obviously the wider the aperture, the more light that's going to be let in at any one time. And this can be found by setting your lens to the lowest f-stop. So if you have a lens like me, this is the Sigma 150 to 600, it goes from f5 to f6.3 when I'm out at the long end. Now this is darker than the very expensive f4 lenses, but frankly they cost the same as a house deposit and I'd rather have a house. But if you don't fancy blowing a house budget on a lens, then you can look at an option like this. This is the 70 to 180 from Tamron, and the big benefit of this lens and other lenses in the 70 to 200 sort of range is that they are f2.8. As such, they're going to be able to let in a lot more light at any one time. But what if we've dropped our aperture to as low as possible, but we still have a very high ISO? Well, the second setting that we can change is shutter speed. Now, the faster our shutter speed, the less light that's going to be let into our lens at any one time. And as such, longer shutter speed is going to allow more light to be let into our camera at any one time, allowing us to have lower ISOs. The issue with having longer shutter speeds is potentially that you introduce some motion blur. So a good rule of thumb when shooting with lenses is to shoot 1 over the focal length. So for this lens right here, it's a 600mm lens, I would be shooting at 1 over 600. But we can also break this rule and bring the shutter speed down even lower in some situations. And to do this, what we need to do is to increase our stability, of which there's a couple of options for this. One of which would be to use in-camera stabilization. So some lenses will have optical stabilization and some camera bodies will have in-camera stabilization. And I'd recommend turning both of these on because it's going to allow you to shoot handheld with longer shutter speeds. But if you don't have in-camera stabilization, there are other options available. One of which would be to use a tripod, but as a rule of thumb, anything that's strong and sturdy is going to give you ample stabilization. Now, when you're shooting with longer shutter speeds, what you'll notice is that your hit rate is naturally going to decrease. Even if you're very stable, there's potentially you're going to get motion blur from the animal moving around if you've got a slow shutter speed. And as such, what you want to do is shoot in short bursts. And a really good tip here when you are shooting in short bursts is to briefly hold your breath. Through doing so, you're going to naturally relax and you're less likely to get micro jitters coming through to your lens. But we also said that the other place that motion might occur is through the animal itself. So one really good tip here is to look at the animal's behavior and try and identify the rest periods. So times when the animal's not moving, perhaps it's paused, looking at something or posed. These are going to give you the best chances to get sharp shots with lower shutter speeds. Now a good tip when reducing your shutter speed is to do it periodically. How I like to do it generally is to start with a fast shutter speed, where the photo is generally going to be a little bit noisier, but I'm more guaranteed to get a sharp photograph. Periodically bringing that shutter speed down, where I'm getting less noisy photos, but I might not be getting sharp photos every time. However, in the back of my mind, I know I've got a sharp photo that I can go away with at the end of the day. Now I said there's one other source of noise, and this is digital noise. This is going to be most apparent when you've incorrectly exposed your photo, and in particular when you've underexposed your photo. You're going to see this in lots of different situations, not just in low light situations. For example, if you've underexposed a bird against a bright sky and you've tried to recover the details, you'll notice that that bird suddenly has colours resembling that of a peacock. And this is the digital noise. So even though underexposing is going to give us a lower ISO, we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot in the long run. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we've exposed our subject correctly. This is going to make the editing process so much easier. The other thing that's really going to help with your editing process is by shooting in RAW. Essentially, this is the largest file type possible, meaning that you're going to have as much data to work with in your editing process as possible. This means that when you are trying to recover the shadows or pull back the highlights, you're going to have the best chance of doing so. And the other huge benefit of shooting in RAW is found in the new features in Lightroom. This is because the AI denoising features in Lightroom will only work with RAW files. Now, I absolutely love these features in Lightroom. However, there are pitfalls that we need to make sure that we're avoiding. When you click on the denoise button, it will pop up with a window which will show you a preview of how your photo is going to look. There's also a slider which shows you the amount of denoising that your photo is going to go through. And what we want to do here is we want to find the balance between removing the noise and making sure our photo still looks natural. This is because when we have a high ISO photo and we push that slider too high, then it really softens the final image, losing all the texture from fur. So in these situations, I'd much rather have a slightly noisy photo than an unrealistic looking one. Now, obviously the denoising feature is the best way of removing the noise, but what else do we need to be aware of when we're editing our photos? As you can imagine, cropping will increase the size of the imperfections that we have in our photograph. And as such, the more we crop into our photo, the more apparent the noise is going to be. So if you do have a noisy photo, even after using denoise, then I would suggest not going too hard on the crop. Another thing to be aware of is the clarity slider. Now, the clarity slider is going to help to give us detail in the midtones. However, if we bring our clarity slider up too far, again, the noise is going to become very apparent. But what we can actually do is bring the clarity slider down, which is going to give us a lovely dreamy effect to our photographs. And actually, it's going to help to mask that noise a little bit more. And if you want to be really fancy with it, then you can reduce the clarity of just the background, making it look nice and soft, while still keeping the detail in our subject. Speaking of detail, we need to have a chat about sharpening, because this is another area where noise can become very apparent. If we globally adjust the sharpening in our photograph, then the noise is really going to stand out, as sharpening is generally applied on areas of contrast. And as you can imagine, noisy pixels contrast from each other really well. So what you can do in the sharpening section is come down to the masking and hold down Alt or Option if you're using a Mac on your keyboard. And this will highlight the areas that you're sharpening. And what you want to do is to bring up the slider to the point where just the details on the subject are highlighted. And so I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to drop a like on it. It helps to push the video out to more people. And finally, thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.